Genghis Khan once stopped the battle just to watch one man escape. This is the man who made him do it.
Autumn, 1221, a cliff above the Indus. A young man sits on his horse at the very edge. Behind him, his army is being cut to pieces. Below him, a long drop into fast freezing water. And across the field, on his own horse, watching, Genghis Khan himself. Two choices, surrender and die a prisoner, or jump. He jumps. Horse and rider go over the edge, hit the river, and somehow, under the eyes of the entire Mongol army, he comes up alive on the far bank. And they say Genghis Khan turned to his own sons, pointed at the man getting away, and told them, "That is what a son should be." The most feared conqueror on earth just stopped a battle to admire the man he was trying to kill. His name was Jalal ad-Din, the last sultan of an empire that no longer existed. The leap into the Indus wasn't the end of his story. It wasn't even the hardest part. To understand how he reached that cliff, you have to go back to the day the world ended. 2 years, that's all Genghis Khan needed to erase one of the richest empires in the Islamic world. Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, all that wealth, all that power, burned, emptied, drowned, simply gone. And the Sultan of Sultans, the proud Muhammad II, did not stand and fight. He ran west, then further west, until he died sick and broken on a tiny island in the Caspian Sea. But here's the thing about dying men. Sometimes, at the very end, they finally see clearly. On that island, Muhammad named his heir, not the grandson his own mother, the queen, had spent years pushing, not the safe choice. He chose the one son everyone in his court had spent 20 years trying to push aside, because he knew that, out of all his children, this was the only one who would actually fight. So who was the man the dying sultan bet his bloodline on? He was probably born around 1199, most likely in Gurganj, the heart of the empire. His father was the sultan, but his mother, a Turkmen woman named Ay-Chichek, did not come from the top tier of the royal household, and in a court obsessed with bloodlines, that was everything. It meant Jalal ad-Din spent his whole early life with a question mark hanging over his right to rule. His own grandmother, the formidable queen Turkan Khatun, didn't want him on the throne at all. She backed a younger grandson instead, a boy with a more acceptable mother. So even inside his own family, Jalal ad-Din was the outsider, the capable one nobody was supposed to choose, and capable he was. By every account, he was the sharpest soldier of all the Sultan's sons, riding into battle as his father's right hand while he was still young. Real talent, and a permanent chip on the shoulder from being passed over. That mix is exactly what makes a man dangerous when everything around him falls apart. Now everything had fallen apart, and he was the only one left standing.
Picture it. You're handed a crown, the same week your kingdom turns to ash, and your own family scheme to keep you off the throne. And the deadliest army on earth is now hunting you by name. So what do? Run? Or walk straight back into the fire?
He started rebuilding. First, he made for Gurganj, the old capital, but the city was already sliding into chaos, and the Turkic commanders there couldn't be trusted. Sensing betrayal, he left. He slipped through the Mongol patrols in Khorasan, beat a Mongol detachment near Nasa along the way, and rode south to Ghazni, in the mountains of what's now Afghanistan. And there, in the wreckage of a dead empire, he did the one thing nobody else in the whole catastrophe was doing. Survivors found him. Afghan fighters, Turkic horsemen, men who'd lost their cities and their families and wanted to hit back. Piece by piece, he built an actual army. And then he didn't sit and wait behind walls. He went hunting Mongols. He found them at Parwan, north of Kabul. What happened there shook the medieval world. The Mongols sent one of Genghis Khan's trusted commanders, Shigi Kutuku. Jalal ad-Din picked ground where their cavalry couldn't maneuver, and he tore them apart. thousands dead. It was one of the only clean defeats the Mongols suffered in the entire Western War, and the effect was electric. All across the conquered lands, cities too terrified to move suddenly rose up. Maybe these Mongols could bleed after all. Maybe this kid was the answer. And then he threw it away. Not on the battlefield, in the tent afterward. His commanders fell into a furious argument over how to split the loot from Parwan. One version says it came down to a single prized horror. Whatever it was stupid, and it was fatal. A huge part of his army walked off in anger and left him. That was the opening Genghis Khan had been waiting for. He had taken the defeat at Parwan personally, and now he came for Jalal ad-Din himself, fast, with everything he had. Which brings us back to that cliff above the Indus in November of 1221. Jalal ad-Din fought there better than anyone had a right to expect. He nearly punched straight through the Mongol center. For a few minutes, it actually looked possible, but Genghis sent 10,000 riders looping around the hills to hit him from the flank, and that was the end. Surrounded, the river at his back, he chose the river, over the cliff, into the Indus, and out alive on the far side. And the most ruthless conqueror in history called off the pursuit and held the man up as an example to his own sons. That kind of respect from that kind of enemy is almost unheard of.
Most people think the story ends at the river. The leap, the escape, the legend, credits roll. But he lived another 10 years, and what he did with them is the part that actually breaks your heart.
He crossed into India with only a few thousand survivors. Some sources say around 4,000, and nothing that looked like an empire. You'd think that's where the story quietly ends, an exiled prince fading away in a foreign land. It didn't. Within months, he was fighting again, carving out a patch of territory across the Punjab and Sindh, pulling in refugees and adventurers, rebuilding from scratch for the second time in 3 years. He tried to make a deal with the powerful Sultan of Delhi, but Delhi wanted nothing to do with the man the Mongols were hunting. To stand near Jalal ad-Din was to stand near Genghis Khan, and nobody wanted that. India was never going to be home. It was only somewhere to survive. So in 1224, he turned around and went back west toward the ruins of his father's empire, still calling himself Shah of Khwarazm, still convinced he could put it all back together. And for a little while, unbelievably, it worked. He set up in Tabriz, in northwestern Iran. He took Kerman and Fars. In 1226, he marched into the Caucasus and seized Tbilisi from the Kingdom of Georgia. For a few years, the king with no kingdom was building a real one out of the rubble, and his name meant something again. But the same fire that won him battles was about to burn down everything he rebuilt. Because off the battlefield, Jalal ad-Din was hopeless. In a fight, he may have been the best commander of his entire generation. In the slow world of alliances and patience and politics, he couldn't stop making enemies. He fought the Seljuks of Anatolia. He fought the Ayyubids, he fought the Georgians, the local Persian lords, and the Mongols who never, ever stopped coming. The other Muslim rulers of the region should have been his natural allies against a shared nightmare. Instead, he wore them down and turned them against him, one pointless war at a time. By 1230, they'd had enough. A coalition led by the Seljuk Sultan Kaikubad crushed him at the Battle of Yasusimen. It broke whatever he had managed to rebuild. And the Mongols, smelling blood, came back in force. The man who could beat anyone in battle had just lost the one war that mattered, the one fought with words, not swords. The end, when it came, had none of the glory of the river. In 1231, a Mongol army poured into northern Iran to hunt him one last time. His soldiers scattered, his allies vanished. Everything he'd clawed back over 10 years dissolved in a matter of weeks. He fled up into the mountains near Diyarbakir, in what's now southeastern Turkey, alone, hunted, stripped of everything once more. But there was no cliff this time, no river, no miracle. In August 1231, somewhere in those hills, he was killed. Not by a Mongol, not by a rival king, but according to most accounts, by a local villager. The man who had stared down Genghis Khan, who had leapt into the Indus and lived, who had carried the name of a dead empire on his own back for a decade, died anonymous in the mountains and was gone. He was 32, and yet the name refused to die with him. The army he'd built didn't lay down its swords. His old warriors became a roving band of mercenaries, drifting across the Middle East for years, selling their skill to whoever would pay. In 1244, they stunned the world by storming Jerusalem itself before they were finally scattered for good in 1246. For a whole generation after the empire was nothing but a memory, the name of Khwarazm still turned up on battlefields a 1,000 miles from where it began. A man who knew him personally left a description. Dark-skinned, short, tougher in Turkish than in Persian, though he spoke both, and on a horse, in a fight, a lion among lions. Braver than any man around him. He never built the empire he wanted. He never had the patience to hold the one he had, but he also never quit. Not after his father died. Not after the Indus. Not after losing everything twice over. And maybe that's why, 800 years later, in the very lands he died fighting for, people still know his name.
He beat the Mongols, leapt the Indus, and rebuilt an empire from nothing twice over. And then, history almost forgot he ever existed. We don't forget people like that here. Stick around.